On the very border of Sparta's dominion, there was only the chilling silence of the winter air. The guards of the border fortress of Clysia, trained to detect the slightest signs of danger from vast distances, saw nothing but endless snowscapes and silence. However, what was approaching from the Boeotian hills was no ordinary army, it was movement itself, embodied in people. At the head of this procession stood Epaminondas, and behind him followed not merely a military force, but history itself, manifested in a living column, 70,000 allied warriors, thousands of freed helots carrying tools, children, and the hope of a new life. These were farmers, builders, exiles returning to lands taken from them generations ago. This was not a conquest, it was a rebirth. And even before the first stone was thrown, a psychological war began, aimed at breaking the Spartan spirit. As the immense column wound its way along the mountain paths, Epaminondas gave an order. His warriors were to sing, not martial hymns, but the forbidden melodies of Messenia, songs that had been strictly forbidden on Spartan soil for over 300 years. These sounds echoed across the hills, reaching hidden helot settlements like the voice of a deity. Men and women wept, overwhelmed with emotion, for they had never before heard the sound of freedom. When the column reached Clysia, an impregnable fortress that had never been successfully stormed, its garrison commander faced a dilemma unforeseen by Spartan law: either offer meaningless resistance and certain death, or retreat and live with the stigma of dishonor. He chose life. And thus, for the first time since the Persian Wars, enemy forces crossed the Spartan border without a single arrow fired. Epaminondas did not immediately attack Sparta. Instead, he turned his attention to something far more devastating: a campaign against the very soul of the Spartan people. Helot barracks were burnt, Cryptea watchtowers were destroyed, and slave pens were torn down. Every freed person became a hammer, shattering the Spartan myth. The sacred band, once a terror on battlefields, now planted olive trees where young Spartans were once forced to kill to survive. They erected monuments on sites where helots were murdered, to keep the population manageable. Every act of creation was an act of rebellion. And as the army approached Sparta itself, burning temples, encamping in sacred groves, and freeing slaves in full view of the agora, the message was unequivocally clear: Sparta had lost its relevance. And for the first time in centuries, the city of warriors did nothing in response. From the summit of Mount Ithome, a mesmerizing view stretched over lands long deprived of freedom. Now, however, by Epaminondas's will, these lands were destined to be transformed, to become a symbol of defiance. Messenia was to be reborn, not as a Spartan stronghold or a camp for the enslaved, but as a free city, built by the hands of those who had once worn shackles. Thousands of former helots, working selflessly around the clock, strove to be ready for the inevitable encounter with the Spartans. Everyone understood, the enemy would come, and by then, the new city had to be prepared to withstand the assault. The sacred band led this monumental construction. Warriors whose spears and shields had crushed enemy phalanxes now, with the same indomitable energy, lifted stones and timbers, building not just walls, but creating history. Cleander and Theron, shoulder to shoulder, carried heavy blocks. When Cleander injured his back setting a cornerstone, Theron worked double shifts for a whole week. Their love, once a weapon in battle, now fortified the city walls. Messenia grew by the hour, walls 40 feet high rose, wide enough for 4 men to walk abreast. However, the city's true grandeur lay not in its architecture, but in its ideology, democracy. It was the first Greek city founded exclusively by former slaves. Inevitably, the Spartans arrived. But instead of a disorganized mob and a broken people, they saw an impregnable, fortified city, full of resolve and ready for defense. The siege began. On one side stood the Spartan army, exhausted, embittered, disciplined, obsessed with reclaiming the lands they had ruled for centuries. On the other, the sacred band, shoulder to shoulder with former helots, who now, as free people, defended not only the walls but also their dignity. This was not merely a battle, it was a clash of civilizations. Inside the city, warriors fought for the future of their children, while outside, they fought for a past that was irrevocably gone. The siege lasted for 6 long months, but Sparta had changed, its power was waning, and the fear it once inspired was no longer absolute. And when the Spartans finally retreated, leaving Messenia unconquered and unyielding, it became clear that the war had been lost not on the battlefield, but in the silence of defeat. For the first time in history, Sparta was unable to reclaim what it considered its rightful possession. The world watched and realized, the era of fear had come to an end. Epaminondas's army pressed on toward Sparta itself, but not with siege engines and fire, rather, with a mere demonstration of force. For 3 days, Epaminondas and his sacred band encamped outside the city walls, their bronze armor dazzling in the sun, their banners proudly unfurled in the winter wind. They made no attempt to assault the city, for it was unnecessary. The Spartans, descendants of those who once defied mighty empires, remained locked inside. For 3 centuries, they had boasted they needed no walls, that Spartan valor was their impenetrable defense. But now they sought refuge behind stone. Foreign warriors feasted in sacred groves, helots gained their freedom directly before the eyes of the city's inhabitants, temples burned, and fields were sown with salt. And yet, no Spartan emerged to meet the enemy. This was not a battle, but a message etched into the annals of Greek history. Sparta had lost its fear-based power, its dominance rested solely on a myth that had been dispelled. On the 4th morning, Epaminondas gave his final order, not to attack or conquer, but to retreat to Messenia, to rebirth and to the future. The meaning of this decision was clear: Sparta did not deserve conquest, it had lost its relevance, its time had passed. An empire built on fear, silence, and slavery was vanquished not by a numerous army or siege machines, but by a band of 300 warriors fighting for love, and by a commander who understood that history is written not only in blood, but in dignity. The sacred band paused on a hill, gazing down at the army departing westward. They cast a final look at the city that once ruled the Greek world and saw only stone and memories. They had come to end an empire, but also to prove something more profound: the future belonged not to domination, but to liberation. And they walked into that future together. The founding of Messenia in 369 BC was an unprecedented event in Greek history. It was not a conquest nor a colonization, but a rebirth. On the very land where helots were once tortured, starved, and murdered, towers and homes now stood. Olive trees were planted where youths were forced into murder. The sacred band, warriors who once struck terror across the Aegean Sea, now worked side by side with freed slaves, laying stones, raising beams, and creating hope. Every brick in Messenia's wall was an act of defiance. It was a city where the oppressed themselves shaped their destiny, a democracy crafted by those once deemed inferior. The Spartans watched on helplessly. Every dawn brought them new humiliation: smoke from forges where slaves hammered out weapons for themselves, banners flying from towers where chains once hung. This was a revolution they could not stop, because this time it wasn't approaching them, it had already bypassed them. Sparta, driven by years of humiliation and an unquenchable thirst for vengeance, unleashed its fury upon Messenia. But instead of ruins, they found a citadel forged from love, pain, and shared purpose. Behind its walls stood the warriors of the sacred band, shoulder to shoulder with former slaves who had found freedom and civic rights. They fought not for empire or revenge, but for the right to exist, for their comrades. The siege lasted for 6 long months, but the Spartans had lost their former superiority, becoming a pale imitation of themselves, tactics devoid of spirit, tradition devoid of fire. When they finally retreated, broken not by spears, but by an indomitable will, it became evident: the days of Spartan conquests were numbered, their power a mere theatrical display, their legend an empty echo. The sacred band had achieved the impossible, not merely defeating Sparta, but outliving it. In 362 BC, a bloodied and weary messenger brought news of victory to Thebes. "We won," he whispered, collapsing in the agora. The Spartan-Athenian alliance was crushed, their armies scattered, their commanders either slain or routed. But then came words that overshadowed the universal joy: Epaminondas is dead. At the Battle of Mantinia, Greece's greatest strategist had presented his final masterpiece, a crushing victory based on his perfected oblique order. The enemy line shattered like a clay pot under a hammer blow. But Epaminondas, a fearless commander and a philosopher with a sword, led the charge, plunging into the thickest part of the battle. At the climax of the fight, an enemy spear pierced his chest. The sacred band, as if possessed, fought their way through enemy ranks to reach their commander. Pelopidas, clasping his dying friend's bloodied armor, whispered, "We won." Epaminondas, gazing up at the heavens, replied, "No, my friend, we lost." He foresaw that without unity, Greece would be consumed by civil wars. With his last breath, the hope for a brighter future died. The prophecy came to pass sooner than anyone could have imagined. After Epaminondas's death, the fragile alliance shattered, city-states retreated into isolation, and Thebes lost its influence. A vacuum into which Philip II of Macedon surged, a man no stranger to the sacred band. As a hostage in Thebes in his youth, Philip meticulously studied the sacred band's training, asking questions, sketching diagrams, and memorizing formations. Pelopidas once remarked, "He learns too quickly, and his smile reminds me of a man plotting murder." That smile now symbolized a ruthless military machine. Philip borrowed Epaminondas's tactics and honed them to perfection, transforming them into an instrument of cold, professional cruelty. His soldiers fought not for love, but for money, conquest, and empire. The sacred band was about to confront this new world, but they were no longer revolutionaries. They had become relics of a bygone era, destined to face their final battle. On August 2, 338 BC, the plain near Kyrenia ran red with blood under a cloudless sky, as if foreshadowing the tragic events to come. On one side, 35,000 Hellenes, Athenians, Thebans, and their allies, desperately clung to the fading hope of preserving their independence. Opposite them stood Philip II of Macedon's war machine, numbering 24,000 highly disciplined and relentlessly determined warriors. The Macedonian left wing was commanded by his 18-year-old son, Alexander, the future conqueror of the world. On the right flank of the Greek coalition stood the 300 warriors of the sacred band, the renowned Theban unit. Their temples gray, their hands scarred, their shields remained locked, their spears sharp, their hearts unwavering. Cleander stood shoulder to shoulder with Theron, his beloved and comrade in arms for 3 decades. Words were superfluous, for they understood each other without them, knowing how this day would end. The battle commenced with a deafening roar. Greek hoplites, with desperate fury, crashed against the Macedonian phalanx, but their assault was insufficient. Philip expertly executed his strategic plan, acting with relentless precision. Alexander, like a hurricane, swept through the Athenian left flank, leaving nothing but confusion and devastation. And the sacred band? They held firm, carving their way through the Macedonian right flank, as they had done countless times before, fighting not for glory, but for each other. When Theron was wounded in the shoulder by a Sarissa, Cleander let out a cry of anguish and, breaking ranks, killed 3 Macedonians to drag his beloved to safety. Around them, other pairs did the same, but this time the enemy did not falter. For every Macedonian who fell, 2 new ones appeared. Philip had brought not just an army, but inevitability itself. The sacred band found themselves encircled. Retreat was impossible, surrender unacceptable. The warriors locked shields, forming a circle on a small hill, and met death as they had lived life, together. One by one they fell, without fear or shame, yet defiant. As the sun dipped below the horizon, 300 bodies lay in perfect battle formation, their spears still pointing outwards, their arms embracing those they loved. Philip, riding across the battlefield, was deeply moved by what he saw and shed tears. "Perish the man," he exclaimed, "who doubts the valor of these warriors." He ordered a monument erected, not to his victory, but to their love, a marble lion, gazing eternally at the spot where 300 heroes proved that love could outlast bronze, empires, and time itself.